The number that changed the conversation was 847. That was the fungal to bacterial biomass ratio in the top 6 inches of Vera Holst's soil, measured in the fall of 2019 by a soil ecologist from Oklahoma State University named Dr. Pamela Cook, who had driven out to Garfield County to take core samples as part of a regional study she had been conducting for 4 years. The number itself requires some explanation, which Pamela was careful to provide when she published the preliminary findings the following spring. In a conventionally managed wheat field in northwestern Oklahoma, a healthy fungal to bacterial ratio typically runs somewhere between 0.3 and 0.8. A ratio above 1.0 is considered exceptional. Vera Holst's field came in at 847, not 8.47, not 84.7. 847. Pamela said later she had the lab run the samples twice. She thought there had been a processing error. There had not been. The field next door, same soil type, same county, same rainfall pattern, same elevation, came in at 0.4. The difference between those two numbers is the story. Everything else is how one woman got from one side of that difference to the other over the course of 31 years, while everyone around her watched and waited and, more often than not, suggested she was doing it wrong. If you are the kind of person who stayed the course when the pressure was on, who held to something that couldn't be proven yet, who waited for the data to catch up to what you already knew, then this channel is for you. Subscribe. Before we go any further, we keep telling stories like this one because they deserve to be remembered. It was the spring of 1988 in Garfield County, Oklahoma, and the County Extension Office had a new herbicide program, a rotational broadleaf suppression system, that combined 2 pre-emergent applications with a single post-emergent pass per season. The program was effective. Yield data from trial plots showed an 8% average improvement in winter wheat production over 3 years. The county agent presented the data at a meeting in Enid in March. Most of the wheat farmers in the room signed up. The logic was plain, and the numbers were there. Vera Holst did not sign up. She was 34 years old that spring, farming 280 acres of winter wheat on the gently rolling red clay ground her father had bought in 1961. In the same section of Garfield County where his father had dry farmed through the Dust Bowl years without losing the place. She had taken over the operation 4 years earlier when her father, Gus Holst, had a stroke that left him with limited mobility but full possession of his opinions, which he expressed regularly from the kitchen table for the next 11 years before his death in 1999. Gus had not been a man who embraced chemicals. That is too simple a way to put it. He had not been opposed to chemicals in any political or philosophical sense. He had not been an organic farmer before that term meant anything commercial, had not been part of any movement, had not read any manifesto. What he had been was a man who had watched the soil on his property for 40 years and had developed specific ideas about what it responded to and what it did not. And one of his specific ideas was that the microbial life in the top 8 inches of his fields was the most important thing he managed, more important than seed variety selection or fertilizer timing or any other single input, and that anything which interrupted that microbial life in ways that were difficult to reverse was a cost he was not willing to pay. He had gotten to this idea slowly, over decades, the way you get to ideas that stay with you. In the summer of 1957, Gus had applied a soil fumigant to 12 acres of his property, a standard practice at the time for managing nematodes, and watched what happened over the following 3 years. The fumigated ground had produced one good crop, and then begun a slow decline in tilth and water retention that he had not been able to fully explain at the time, but could describe precisely. The soil had changed texture, gone from a loose, crumbling structure with visible aggregation to something harder and finer that crusted after rain and dried faster than it should. It had taken 8 years to fully recover, and the recovery had happened not through any intervention, but through letting the field rest under a mixed cover and leaving it alone. He had never fumigated again. He had also read, in the late 1960s, an agricultural research paper. He kept it in a folder. And Vera still had that folder from a soil scientist at the University of Nebraska, who was studying what she called the secondary cost of broad-spectrum soil treatments, which was the disruption of mycorrhizal networks that connected plant root systems across a field. The paper was technical and dry and not written for farmers, but Gus had read it twice and made notes in the margin in the same tight blue ink handwriting he used for everything. His principal note, on page 6, was 4 words: "The connections are the yield." He said that to Vera more than once when she was growing up, and she had not fully understood it at the time, and had understood it more as she farmed and learned what mycorrhizal networks actually did, how the fungal threads threaded through the soil and connected root systems and transferred water and nutrients and chemical signals across distances that no single plant could manage alone, and had come to believe, as her father had believed, that the network itself was the farm's primary asset, more durable and more valuable than any input you could buy. She told the county extension agent in 1988 that she had decided not to participate in the herbicide program. He was a man named Barry Olson, who had been in the county 12 years and who was patient and professional, and who told her he respected her position, and who also, she knew from said privately that Vera Holst was going to learn a hard lesson about yields. She did not lose yield in 1988. She did not lose yield in 1989, 1990, or 1991, though her production ran 3 to 5% below the county average in those years, which her neighbors noted. She had kept records since she first started farming composition notebooks, 1 per season, with weekly observations on soil condition, crop emergence, rainfall, input timing, and anything that struck her as worth noting. By 1993, she had noticed something that she began tracking more specifically. Her soil was retaining moisture differently than her neighbors' fields in dry years. Not dramatically. Not in a way that was visible from the road, but in a dry spring, when the county average topsoil moisture was running 30 to 35% below normal, her field readings were consistently 6 to 9 points higher. She made a note of it. She didn't tell anyone. The 1996 wheat season in Garfield County was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not Dust Bowl dry, but dry in the specific way that separates the top third of a county's producers from the bottom 2/3 in a bad year. County-wide average yield for winter wheat that season was 24 bushels per acre. Vera Holst's fields came in at 31. Her neighbor to the east, who had been in the herbicide rotation program since 1988, and who ran a clean, professional operation by every conventional measure, came in at 22. Nobody said anything to her directly. She noticed. There was a man named Delbert Crane who farmed the quarter section to her south, and who had been the most vocal in 1988 about the county program's merits, and who had told Vera, in the parking lot of the co-op elevator in Hennessy after the March meeting that year, that she was making a mistake she would feel by 1990 at the latest. He had not been cruel about it. He was not that kind of man. He had said it the way you say something to a neighbor you respect when you believe they are about to back themselves into a corner. She had thanked him and driven home. In 1996, Delbert Crane came in at 21 bushels. She knew because the elevator numbers were not private. She did not mention it to him. He did not mention. They continued to be friendly neighbors, as they had always been, and the subject did not come up again directly, though she noticed he walked her field edge with her the following spring for the first time in 8 years and asked questions he had not asked before. She answered them without making a point of any of it. By 2003, she had been doing what she did for 15 years, and the results were accumulating in the notebooks in a pattern she found increasingly difficult to misread. Her soil had changed. Not just the moisture retention, the structure had changed. The color had deepened. The smell had changed in the way that soil smell changes when fungal populations are active. That particular earthen mushroom scent that comes up from a freshly turned row in good biological weather. She had not been adding organic matter beyond what the crop residue contributed. She had not been inoculating. She had not been doing anything except leaving the system as intact as she could manage. The 2003 notebook had an entry in late April, after the winter wheat broke dormancy, that read, "Aggregation excellent. Poor structure visible on core pull. Root hairs at 4-inch depth, showing heavy fungal association. Not adding anything. Don't add anything." She had underlined that last sentence twice. She was not always certain she was right. She was certain that adding inputs she did not understand would not make her more certain, only more committed to the wrong path if the path was wrong. So she watched and waited and wrote it down. She wrote in her 2003 notebook on the last page of that season, "The connections are the yield." Barry Olson had retired in 1998. His replacement, a younger agent named Kirk Stahl, stopped by the farm in 2004 on a routine visit and stood at the field edge for a long time without saying anything. Then, he asked her what she was putting down for mycorrhizal support. She said nothing specific. He said, "That was interesting." He wrote something in his own notebook and then drove away, and she did not hear from him directly on the subject again. But she heard from a soil scientist at OSU the following year who said Kirk had mentioned her operation in a departmental conversation and asked whether anyone had ever properly studied it. Nobody had. Pamela Cook began the Garfield County study in 2015. It was a comparative study of soil biology across 10 farms in the county, measuring bacterial and fungal biomass, mycorrhizal colonization rates, available phosphorus and nitrogen, organic matter percentage, and aggregate stability, a full biological inventory of the soil on each farm, correlated against long-term yield records going back 20 years. She had designed it to cover a range of managements. She had included Vera Holst's farm because Kirk Stahl had flagged it as an outlier worth examining. She spent 4 years taking samples before she ran the comprehensive analysis in the fall of 2019. The ratio of 847 was not the only number. Vera's mycorrhizal colonization rate, the percentage of her crop's root system that was actively networked with fungal threads at the time of sampling, was 94%. The county average in the study was 31%. Her available phosphorus, despite receiving 0 synthetic phosphorus input for the preceding decade, was running at 62 parts per million, within normal productive range. Accessing nutrients, the biological network was mobilizing from the soil mineral base itself. Her aggregate stability score, a measure of how well soil particles hold together under water stress, directly related to the moisture retention she had been tracking since 1993, was in the 97th percentile for all soils of her type ever sampled by the OSU. Pamela Cook said she stood in that field for a while before she wrote anything down. She said she had run hundreds of soil sampling surveys across Oklahoma and Kansas, and she had never seen numbers like that outside of an undisturbed prairie remnant or an old-growth riparian corridor. She said it looked, biologically, like land that had never been farmed. She said that was not a criticism of farming. She said it was the most extraordinary soil she had ever measured on a working crop farm. She said she had to think carefully about how to present those numbers in the paper, because 847 as a fungal to bacterial ratio in a cultivated field had no real peer in the published literature she could cite for context. She would be presenting a finding for which there was no established reference point. She told the department chair that if she published it without extensive methodological documentation, reviewers would assume the lab had made an error. She documented the methodology extensively. 2 reviewers still asked for the samples to be rerun. She ran them again. The number was 847. Vera Holst was 65 years old when Pamela ran those numbers. She had been farming that ground for 35 years at that point, using the same approach she had started with, informed by the same notebooks her father had read, and a folder of research papers that included one from the University of Nebraska, 1968, with 4 words written on page 6 in tight blue ink. She had not published anything. She had not given any talks. She had not joined any organization. She had not needed the county average to confirm what she could measure herself. Pamela Cook published the study in a peer-reviewed soil science journal in the spring of 2021. Vera's farm was identified only as Site 7 in the published paper. But in Garfield County, Oklahoma, where 280 acres of winter wheat ground is not an anonymous thing, people knew. Kirk Stahl, who had retired from the Extension Service in 2018, read the paper and sent her a handwritten note. It said he had been in agricultural extension for 23 years and had seen a lot of outlier farms and had learned to trust his instincts when something didn't fit the pattern, and that visiting her field in 2004 had been one of those moments, and that he was glad someone had finally measured it properly. Barry Olson, who was 81 years old and living in Enid, did not read because nobody thought to tell him, which is fine. The yield data had been speaking for a long time without his help. Delbert Crane, who was 77 and still farming the quarter section to her south, read it. He drove over one afternoon in April of 2021 and stood at the field edge and looked at the ground for a while. Then, he said he thought he might have been wrong about some things in 1988. Vera said she thought he had been reasonable about it at the time. He said that was generous. She said it was just true. He asked if she would walk him through what she did. She walked him through it. Vera still farms. She is 71 now. Her notebooks run to 41 volumes covering 37 seasons. She has begun transcribing the older ones into a digital format because the composition book paper from the late 1980s is starting to brown at the edges, and she wants the records complete. She is doing the transcription herself, in the evenings, because nobody else knows the handwriting well enough to be reliable. She was asked by a graduate student in Pamela's department in the summer of 2022 whether she would be willing to share her management history for a follow-on study. The student wanted to understand the decision sequence, what she had done, in what order, and why. Vera spent 3 afternoons going through the notebooks with her. She told the student about the fumigation of 1957 and the 8 years it took to recover. She told her about the paper from Nebraska and the 4 words on page 6. She said the most important single thing she had ever done was refuse to break what she didn't know how to fix. The student asked her when she had known she was right. Vera said she had never thought about it in those terms. She said she hadn't needed to be right. She had needed the soil to be intact. Those were different things. She went back to her notebooks. The soil went on doing what soil does when you leave the connections alone. Some assets do not appear on any balance sheet. They live in the top 6 inches of a field, and they take 30 years to build and an afternoon to destroy, and they do not come back on any schedule that is convenient for a quarterly review. Gus Holst knew that. He left it to his daughter the only way he knew how, by showing her what to watch and trusting her to keep watching. That is what she kept. That is what the number was.